In this Dating the Old Testament video, I'm going to talk about the book of Ruth. Let me share my screen here. Okay, the book of Ruth. Ruth is set during the days of the Judges, but unlike the stories in the Judges, Ruth is a pleasant or a nice and happy story. The conflict and the difficulty shows up primarily in the first chapter, and then it gets better from there. Ruth is one of the books where there's a critical view of when it was written, and there's a more traditional view. The critical view is that it was written in the 6th to 4th century BC, so it's a post-exilic book written after the exile. The traditional view places it much closer to the actual lifetime of Ruth. I put Solomon's reign there. Some people might say a little before or after, but sometime around there. So there's a good many years difference between the critical view and the traditional view. In this case, unlike most of the others, I think that difference of opinion is probably less important in Ruth than for the other books, although it still does make a difference. When you want to put a date on it, the one thing that you can hang your hat on is this verse here, when Ruth has a son and they name him Obed, and he's the father of Jesse and the father of David. And so that tells you that by the time Ruth was written, everybody knew who David was. So at least David has to have been a king, or maybe a little bit later. And then after that, there's actually a short genealogy, which once again ends with David. Now, the critical view about Ruth is that it was written in the post-exilic time frame, and it was written to be what they call anti-particularism. And that would be in opposition to the policy of Ezra and Nehemiah, really, because Ezra and Nehemiah did not want the Jews who had returned from exile to intermarry with any of the locals. And that was a real sticking point. And so the idea is that Ruth was written in opposition to that. And you can see in the book of Ruth, Ruth is a foreign woman. And so the story of Ruth is kind of inclusive of foreigners. So that's why they came up with that view. But in response to that, I don't think that's really right. A book that was opposing Ezra and Nehemiah seems to me like it would be unlikely to make it into the canon if it was a subversive book that was trying to actually undermine what the leaders of the time were teaching. Furthermore, the opposition that they had, Ezra and Nehemiah and others earlier in the scriptures and later in the New Testament too, is the opposition to intermarriage was based on religion. It wasn't really based on a racial opposition. It was based on religion, because there was the feeling that if you married outside the faith, that would lead you away from the Lord. And of course, it turned out to be very true in cases like Solomon and others. But that doesn't really apply to Ruth, because clearly Ruth converted. So it doesn't really apply. And then just a word about the historicity of the book. If you say that it was written much later, you might say that it's kind of a parable or a novel, so to speak. But I don't think that's right. Ruth is in the genealogy of David. And to support it, Ruth is a Moabite. So you have the unusual thing that David left his parents in Moab when he was in trouble, so they would be protected when Saul was after David. And David's parents, David's father, Jesse's grandmother would have been a Moabitess. Linguistics, I'm not in these videos going to talk much about Hebrew linguistics, but you can tell the difference between early biblical Hebrew and late biblical Hebrew. Late Hebrew has some very specific markers, and Ruth doesn't really have those. And so rather than go into detail, I'm just going to leave you with one quote here. Samuel Rawls Driver was one who's really in the critical school. When we were talking about the Torah, he was a supporter of the documentary hypothesis. He was a very pronounced Hebrew scholar, but he breaks with the ranks of the critics on the book of Ruth. He says, it seems to the writer that the general beauty and purity of the style of Ruth point more decidedly to the pre-exilic period. So he thinks that Ruth is an older book, like I do. And one other point, there's not a whole lot that can be brought to bear to date the book, but there is one other point that might be worth mentioning. I haven't talked before about the way the Hebrew Bible is structured. The order of the books is not quite the same as you would see in an English Bible. It's divided into three clear parts, and they're called the law, the prophets, and the writings. Later in the Bible and in the New Testament, it makes reference to those parts. The law are the books of Moses, Genesis through Deuteronomy. The prophets are a little bit different, and they're divided between the former prophets, which we tend to talk about as being historical books. Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. You can see that Ruth is not listed among the prophets, so it's not in there. And then the latter prophets are divided again. You have Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. Those are the major prophets. And then in a Hebrew scroll, all the minor prophets are really in one scroll. So that's sometimes called the 12. So those are the prophets. And then in the writings, you have Ruth there among the writings. But what's worth pointing out, I think, is that you might look at that and think that it's chronologically in order, and it kind of is. The first set of prophets are clearly in chronological order. But then when you get to the later prophets, the writing prophets, like the minor prophets there, they are also mostly in chronological order, and same with the three. Isaiah was followed by Jeremiah, which is followed by Ezekiel. But then if you look at the writings, those books are not exactly in chronological order, but they are in, I think, close to the order in which they were written. And Ruth is rather up close to the front. It's really before the book of Song of Songs and Ecclesiastes, which are usually assigned to Solomon. So for what it's worth, that may also be a hint that Ruth was one of the earlier books to be written. So my conclusion on Ruth is it was written during the United Kingdom period, probably during the reign of Solomon. I want to attach some things to the reign of Solomon just because in the Old Testament period, there were a couple clusters of times when a number of different things were written. And the period of Solomon was a peaceful, law and order, lawful time, which several things seem to have been written during that time. So I think maybe Ruth was one of those as well. So that's what we have for the book of Ruth. Thank you for watching, and I'll come back later soon with another video.